Welcome to this session of Effective Altruism, the online course. I'm very happy to be in Boston at the offices of Oxfam America, and I have with me Ray Offenheiser, who has been President of Oxfam America for the past 18 years. Welcome, Ray. Welcome to the course.
Nice to be with you, Peter.
Thank you. So we're going to be talking about poverty and its causes and what can be done about it today. Let me start off by asking you, we're in the United States, there's poverty in the United States, there's poverty around Boston, and of course there's poverty elsewhere in the world. So why work on poverty far away from us rather than right here in Boston?
Well, I think Oxfam has historically become a poverty-based organization, I think initially as a response to the humanitarian crises in the aftermath of World War II, where literally we had tens of millions of people displaced by conflict. And it was the cause of that it was actually those events that brought us into being as an organization. And the humanitarian impulse of the British population at that time that actually caused us to create Oxfam as a response to that humanitarian need. But as time went on, we began to see that there were a variety of other important needs that populations face, and particularly the newly independent countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we felt, compelled in some sense to deal with those needs as well as the immediate short-term needs of a humanitarian crisis.
So tell me a little bit more about what poverty actually means for people in those developing countries.
Well, I think perhaps the simplest way to describe it is the absence of public goods. In other words, the absence of services that we all take for granted: education, health services, environmental services, infrastructure, and so forth. And people lacking those lack the opportunities to actually access markets, to access food, an inadequate supply, access educational opportunities that might enable them to lift themselves out of poverty. So that, in some sense, is the historic way that poverty has been looked at, and perhaps the simple definition might be the absence of public goods to those marginalized or more vulnerable populations.
All right. And if somebody said, well, what really is the cause of this? Is there any one underlying cause, or are there a series of causes?
Well, I think what's happened in Oxfam, we've gone through a bit of an evolution on this question, and I think we historically, like many of the organizations that do the work that we do in similar contexts, we actually worked with grassroots organizations to address these, if you will, public goods needs at a local level for many, many years. And over time, we realized that we needed, in some sense, to create organizations that could provide those services, and built local NGOs. But we began to realize over time that that was not enough, and that we needed to be looking at root causes. And we realized that the absence of public goods definition, in some sense, had us focusing on symptoms rather than causes. And we adopted a somewhat different definition over time, which was defining poverty as social exclusion, with the assumption that in many countries where we work, you find populations who are receiving all these public services and are receiving all these the access to these public goods, but then you find excluded populations that are excluded for a variety of different reasons in different contexts. It might have to do with race, ethnicity, class, location, a variety of different issues. And so we've gradually tried to figure out, if we take on the definition of social exclusion as sort of the root cause, what does that mean in different contexts?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, if you could tell me a little bit more about that, because if there are people not getting these services because of their race or ethnicity, or because of their geographical location perhaps, is this actually an attitude of other people in this region that needs to be changed? Or?
Well, I guess as we think about development, we have come to believe that basically development is about supporting states to become more effective in delivering these public goods. But we've realized over time that just doesn't happen naturally, and that there is market failure, and there are reasons why states, perhaps either because they're not adequately funded, or there are these reasons why particular populations are excluded, that certain populations are disadvantaged. And that what we need, in some sense, to get effective development is to start a conversation between affected citizens and their government or the state about why those particular barriers might exist that limit people's access to those needed services, and particularly the needed services that are going to create the opportunities for people to work their way out of poverty. And we believe most people in poverty are very keen to actually find those opportunities and will work very hard if given them. And so we've tried to build this conversation, and maybe with the idea that effective development is about building that social contract between citizens and the state that will yield the best possible outcomes.
So this sounds a little different from what I guess most people would imagine that aid organizations would do if you're talking about building a conversation. Does this mean that you're not going in there and providing things like, say, clean water or sanitation or other better agricultural techniques, something of that sort, or is that still part of the process that you regard as building this conversation?
Well, in all the humanitarian work we do, we're meeting immediate needs. And we have a very large humanitarian operation that's probably operating right now in 10 countries, and we're frontline providers in all of the major humanitarian emergency scenarios all over the world: Syria, the Congo, South Sudan, and so forth. But in the work we're doing in what we would characterize as long-term development, our starting point is with communities and with grassroots organization, or if you will, partners, national indigenous organizations, trying to define what is the sort of issue that is most top of mind for them that they feel needs to be addressed. And in most cases, we might be working with them to provide a program that would allow for people to access water, to access financial services, to better access food markets. And what we try to do is create innovative solutions that might translate themselves into a policy option for governments that can then be the starting point for that conversation with governments about how can we take a good idea that's implemented at a particular local or regional level and translate it into something at a higher level that can actually become national policy and advantage many more people who are perhaps suffering the consequences of in the same way as those communities where we might start that initiative.
So you see what you're doing as kind of model projects for what can be done to help people, and you hope that the governments will then step in and say, this works, it's the kind of thing we want to do.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the aid system historically has been oftentimes it started with the premise that we know best, we bring the technology, we bring the ideas, we bring the solutions. And I think what we've learned over decades has been the development that has actually been durable over time has actually started with the premise that people in countries are going to have to develop themselves and in some sense be given the chance to build that social contract with their government and also build the institutions that are actually going to deliver those public goods over time. And so we've in some sense shifted our focus away from a northern-centric development approach that is maybe driven by ideas of delivering technology and ideas and so forth, to one that's centered on people's desires and building citizenship and building effective states and fostering a conversation that's actually anchored in a human rights perspective. In other words, that people have a right to food and a right to basic social and economic opportunity. And the question then is, how do you build the social contract or the social compact that's actually going to enable people to negotiate the terms of that deal with the state such that resources will be distributed adequately to meet their basic needs?